Good morning. Can the door be closed in the back, please? Thank you. Good morning. I'm very, very happy to have here Lisa Steinhaven. She's Associate Professor of English at Ohio University in Zanesville. She specialized in British and American modernist literature, the Beats poets, silent film comedy, especially the work of Charlie, Sidney, and Chaplin, and Buster Keaton. In 2010, Lisa organized a very large conference in Zanesville that hosted over 11 participants for over 11 countries outside of the U.S. And in 2014, when we celebrated the Trump first, the celebration of the Trump, the centennial of the birth of the Trump figure, Lisa presented a paper on what was then an unpublished, yet unpublished project that is now published, that I personally felt was by far one of the major new discoveries about connections between Chaplin and American culture, that then I spoke to all the participants at that very large conference, and very, very few people knew about those connections that I found extremely interesting. Lisa is a real researcher, real researcher. So for this book that now Charlie Chaplin's Little Trump in America that you see here, I want to do a very good advertising, because it's really an extremely revelatory book. She researched in archives really all over the world for several years, really. And so I'm really, really glad to introduce Lisa in this presentation today. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks to Cecilia and Il Cinemateca di Bologna for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. And if you've seen some sections of this particular presentation before, I've added a lot of documents from the archives that I didn't have when I gave it before, and so you'll have some new things to look at. So this is a subset of the larger book, which is about the Little Tramp's resurgence in America about 1947 to 77. And I'm just today going to be talking about two groups of countercultural artists. That's the Bohemians and the Beats. They are distinguished from each other. Many of the countercultural artists identified with Chaplin the man's political problems and subsequently attached themselves to the Little Tramp as sort of a symbol of the Beat philosophy and lifestyle. Some, such as Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Bob Kaufman, identified with many of the general attributes of the character, having experienced abandonment, poverty, and isolation in their early lives. Therefore, the utilization of the figure in both Bohemian and Beat poetry is different as each particular artist, really. Regarding the Little Tramp's persona, it was not the Beats, but their immediate forebears, the Bohemians, who first looked at the Little Tramp with feelings of affinity. And I want to start with, of course, novelist and film critic James Agee, who could be labeled the first person to really kind of bring him up when Charlie was being pilloried by the press. Around 1947, or thereabouts, he wrote a screenplay called The Tramp in the New World, which was about 94 typed pages, and it exists in the Charlie Chaplin archive today. Although it would not have been known by writers and artists to come, it's interesting to me that Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky also thought of the Little Tramp as the sole survivor of a nuclear holocaust in one of the texts that I'm going to be talking about a little later. Certainly what inspired at least these three writers with the threat of nuclear annihilation presented by the bomb drops in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, coupled by a similar threat emanating from the USSR at the time. Agee especially found himself uncomfortably close to the topic when he wrote a feature article for Time entitled The Bomb that ran in the August 20th, 1945 edition. It's an unsigned piece, just at the end of World War II. And here's a little bit from that particular essay. He says, in describing the magnitude of the wartime use of the bomb in human history, He noted that with the controlled splitting of the atom, humanity, already profoundly perplexed and disunified, was brought inescapably into a new age in which all thoughts and things were split and far from controlled. The rational mind had won the most Promethean of its conquests over nature and had put into the hands of common man the fire and force of the sun itself. But was man equal to the challenge? Man's fate has forever been shaped between the hands of reason and spirit, now in collaboration, again in conflict. Now reason and spirit meet on final ground. If either or anything is to survive, they must find a way to create an indissoluble partnership. So how long after these words must A.G. have lost faith in this partnership and instead placed it in the hands of Chaplin's little tramp, humanity's savior, at least according to his play? And of course, yesterday, Cecilia mentioned this particular article, which was written by James A.G. and appeared in Life on September 3rd, 1949, called Comedy's Greatest Era. The essay is largely a revalidation of the silent film comedian and his laugh-making strategies. In comparison with what A.G. calls the modern comedian, those of the silent period win the contest. He states, when a modern comedian gets hit in the head, for example, the most he is apt to do is look sleepy. When a silent comedian got hit on the head, he seldom let it go so flatly. He realized a broad license and a ruthless discipline within that license. It was his business to be as funny as possible physically, without the help or hindrance of words. So he gave us a figure of speech, or rather a vision, for loss of consciousness. In other words, he gave us a poem, a kind of poem, moreover, that everybody understands. And A.G. is not the first critic to kind of equate the physicality of the silent comedians with poetry, but perhaps he's the first to remind us of it after the war. With this assertion and his specific description that the finest pantomime, the deepest emotion, the richest and most poignant poetry were in Chaplin's work, it becomes easier to understand why the poets of the counterculture soon became interested in Chaplin and his persona as inspiration for their own work. So we're going to start now with Peter D. Martin, who was not particularly a writer or a poet, but certainly important to this whole particular movement. In 1952, he started a pop culture magazine, which you probably haven't heard of, called City Lights Magazine. It only ran for 5 issues. And in that particular 5 issues, he had multiple essays on Chaplin, including Pauline Kael's first ever film review, which was a desecration of Chaplin's limelight, pretty much. Next, he paired himself with Lawrence Ferling, who became Lawrence Ferlinghetti, to open the first pocket bookshop. In other words, all the books were paper, and that was called the City Lights Bookstore. So both of these ventures were named after Chaplin's 1931 film. Ferlinghetti himself arrived in North Beach in San Francisco in about 1952. He's an interesting character. I'm going to talk a little bit about his bio because there's a lot about it that kind of correlates to what we think of as both Charlie and the Little Tramp. His childhood was marked by his father's death when he was only 6 months old, and then by his mother's being institutionalized for mental illness a short time later, both eerie parallels to Chaplin. Although more a promoter of the beats than a beat himself, in fact, he calls himself a bohemian. That's why he's here in the chronology. Ferlinghetti published his first Chaplin poem called Constantly Risking Absurdity in about 1958. And I think this is one of the first poems to use Little Tramp persona, actually. It's largely based on a scene from the circus that you may know. This one. And you'll be able to tell that when I read the poem to you here. Ferlinghetti chooses the tramp here to stand in for himself as the figure for the poet, and he does that throughout his poetry writing career at different times. Here he's essentially an acrobat trying to effect some sort of balance on the high wire of poetic art. So it's called Constantly Risking Absurdity. Constantly risking absurdity and death whenever he performs above the heads of his audience, the poet, like an acrobat, climbs on rhyme to a high wire of his own making, and balancing on I-beams above a sea of faces, places his way to the other side of day, performing entre-shots and sleight-of-foot tricks, and other high theatrics, and all without mistaking anything for what it might not be, for he's the super realist who must perforce perceive taught truth before the taking of each stance or step in his supposed advance toward that still higher perch where beauty stands and waits with gravity to start her death-defying leap. And he, a little Charlie Chaplin man who may or may not catch her eternal form, spread-eagled in the empty air of existence. So shortly after this point, Ferlinghetti begins to think of, I really believe in this particular poem that he's actually looking at the little tramp as the beloved character of the 1920s and 30s. And from this point on, though, Ferlinghetti and others start to think of the little tramp character more politically. In order to do that, Ferlinghetti came up with this idea that, in fact, the poet had to be what's called an enemy of the state, or Plato's poet gadfly. So I'll read this little bit from Plato's Apology, where Socrates argues, "For if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am a sort of gadfly, given to the state by the god, and the state is like a great and noble steed, who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. And as you will not easily find another like me, I will advise you to spare me." So Ferlinghetti starts to take this particular idea of the poet gadfly and apply it to Chaplin. And he said in one particular interview, "Chaplin's character represents for me the very definition of a poet. A poet, by definition, has to be an enemy of the state. If you look at Chaplin's films, he's always been pursued by the police." This is still Ferlinghetti talking. "That's why he's still such a potent symbol in the cinema, the little man against the world." So this harsher, grittier interpretation we'll see in a couple of later poems that I'm going to talk about in the 1970s. So Ferlinghetti bought the store for $1 in 1955, believe it or not, because Martin wanted to get out and move to New York City. And so at that point, he starts the City Lights Journal. This is the first issue that you see here with Allen Ginsberg on the cover. Pretty soon, this particular bookstore becomes pretty much equivalent to Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company in Paris. It was a bookstore where any particular countercultural writer with any merit could get things published that other publishers just would not publish. In fact, for Ginsberg's Howl, for instance, Ferlinghetti and even his store clerks went to court on obscenity charges. So Ferlinghetti was very willing to kind of take up that mission. So as writers and critics began to work out what exactly the Beat generation was, words like disaffiliation, subversive, outcast, and social refusal, not to mention Allen Ginsberg's more apt angel-headed hipsters from Howl, emerged to describe them. Dorothy Van Ghent believed the Beat comes from anonymous parentage, parents whom he denies in correct mythological fashion. He has received a mysterious call to the road, the freights, the jazz dens, the Negro streets. For Paul O'Neill, the Beats can be much more accurately described as a cult of the pariah. It yearns for the roach-guarded mores of the skid road, the flop house, the hobo jungle, and the slum, primarily to escape regimentation. More frankly, Thomas Parkinson suggests that the group can be differentiated from the Bohemians by their religiosity, experimental interest in hallucinogenic drugs and occasional dabbling in addictive drugs, proximity to criminality, and fascination with moral depravity for its own sake. Using the pejorative beatnik, he asserts that their contempt for simple comfort and cleanliness is the counterpart of mindless possessiveness, status-seeking, and other elaborate forms of greed. Much of this definition has likenesses in Chaplin's character of the Little Tramp, making it easy to understand how the Beat artists so readily made the correlation between themselves, their lifestyle, and their socio-political beliefs, and those of this fictional persona. With 1953 noted as the year of their emergence, the Beats that is, and this being the first year of Chaplin's exile from America, The Beats could then look to Chaplin's political problems as just more of their own, thereby making him into a particularly significant cause célèbre for the movement. Even those outside the movement were making these correlations. John Ciardi, I found this particular quote and I thought it was very telling. He says, "The Beat is Charlie Chaplin ridiculously in love and being chased by cops. He lives in a skid row under the stars in the company of other personal madmen poets." So soon after Ferlinghetti's Constantly Risking Absurdity came out, Bob Kaufman kind of took up the Chaplin banner. And Kaufman is interesting because he's an African-American from New Orleans who was both Jewish and Catholic. And he had a career in the Merchant Marines and also ended up trying to recruit communists in the Deep South, which is kind of an interesting job. His most famous poem is called A Bomunist Manifesto, and if you've never heard it, I suggest you look it up. It's amazing. Most notably, San Francisco Chronicle critic Herb Caen coined the term beatnik in reference to Kaufman and his lifestyle, one which clearly allowed him a close affinity with Chaplin's little tramp persona due to its characteristics of poverty, delinquency, and degeneracy. And Kaufman never really wrote things down. He had to be motivated to do so. So he was very much an oral presentation sort of a poet. He would show up in a bar or a restaurant and simply recite. Many of Kaufman's poems focused on political injustices, and so his first one is his first Chaplin one. It's called Patriotic Ode on the 14th anniversary of the persecution of Charlie Chaplin, written in 1959. And here he's inspired by the headlines that Chaplin is making more than films, pretty much. Patriotic Ode on the 14th anniversary of the persecution of Charlie Chaplin. Come on out of there with your hands up, Chaplin, in your Sitting Bull suit with your amazing new Presto lighter. We caught you. We found your fingerprints on the World's Fair. Give us back the money and start over as a cowboy. Come on, Chaplin. We mean business. So basically, he's thinking about perhaps the Joan Barry paternity trial, which Chaplin was experiencing in the early 1940s, and in which he had to be fingerprinted. You may have seen this particular picture here. And equating some of the problems that Sitting Bull was going through with what Chaplin was going through. So these are some of his two favorite cause célèbres that he often wrote about. Carol Chessman is the other one, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Kaufman's interest in Chaplin finds its way into another poem in 1959 called Sullen Bakeries of Total Recall, and that was included in this collection, Solitudes Crowded with Loneliness. I think I have that here. Yes. And it's about his Jewish heritage, pretty much, and I think he probably thought of Chaplin here because of The Great Dictator, which he'd seen 20 years or so before. He says, I think, let me start a little back here. Sometimes I feel the ones who escape the ovens where Germans shall forever cook their spiritual meals are leaning against my eyes. You can see how kind of surrealistic his poetry was. After the third stanza, the poet has contemplated his anger at first Moses, then the Germans, and then himself for not committing suicide. He's angry for himself for not committing suicide. I think of Chaplin and I roll a mental cigarette, he says. I slowly remove my bayonet, write a poem about a poetic poem dedicated to the Aleutian Islands. So in these lines, Chaplin is serving as a sort of relief for this very serious poem about Jewishness and the Nazis and everything else. I think of Chaplin and roll a mental cigarette. So he's trying to get some sort of help from Chaplin as a plucky little tramp character, which he can look to for inspiration. And then Jack Kerouac, I'm sure you've all heard of him, a writer famous for his semi-autobiographical novel On the Road, was also an early beat Chaplinist, believe it or not. So the first thing was Visions of Cody. Now, Visions of Cody had trouble finding a publisher, and it didn't get published until 1972, and really much to the credit of Allen Ginsberg for getting it published even then. But it was written in the 1950s, 1950-51, and it's a kind of a surrealistic narrative that includes Neal Cassady, which you may have known from on the road, and also Kerouac and several other characters. So in a chapter entitled Imitation of the Tape, Cody, the Neil Cassidy character, riffs on his dream about a movie house, people with surrealistic encounters between unlikely groupings of characters, many who are recognizable Hollywood figures. So in Reel 2, Cody describes Charlie Chaplin twinking in an early morning dew. I couldn't show you Chaplin peeing on a wall, so I chose this one. Just as big two-time Butch is about to heave a pail of cold water over the wall. So while this particular instance of Chaplin in a particular piece of writing of Kerouac's is not political, it is kind of recalcitrant in terms of social mores. So that kind of falls in line with where we're going here. Chaplin also finds his way into Kerouac's 52nd chorus of Mexico City Blues from 1959. It's evident from the poem that Kerouac has seen Chaplin's 1947 film Monsieur Verdoux, and in fact I had found some correspondence between Kerouac and Ginsberg that talked about seeing the film in 1947, so I know that this is true. And in these particular 52nd chorus, we see a Chinaman who's leaving in a boat because he cannot return to his country for some reason. So there's that whole theme of homelessness kind of fostered up in the first part of the stanza. And then he talks about the Verdoux character. I'm crazy everywhere, like Charlie Chaplin, dancing in moral turpitude, playing Bluebeard killer on satin ass-kiss couches with itchy mustache, so well known to dreamers of Choice's century. So in consideration of both these examples, the poet concludes, every one of us Roman circus sacrifices, every one returned for payment in American madhouse. Let's see here. Here we go. Picture of Verdoux. Kerouac reflects here on the absurdity of one man, despite his legal citizenship, being unable to land his vessel on the turf of his homeland, and then another man, Chaplin, being lionized for the role he assumes in Monsieur Verdoux, one that seems uncomfortably to compound and underscore the legal and personal problems Chaplin was experiencing in his own life, problems that resulted in his being similar to the Chinese boatman, a man without a country. So perhaps what Kerouac wants to highlight in these two examples, beyond the inherent absurdity, is the individuality of the two characters. Chaplin's personal fortitude in taking on a Bluebeard role at a time in his career in which the American outcry against him was becoming deafening was enormous, thereby allowing both the persona and the man once again to stand alone as an embodiment of nonconformity, self-possession, and certainly an enemy of the state. And then one of my favorite ones is this particular piece called Collaboration, Letter to Charlie Chaplin, which was written by Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky in 1961 after they had been to India and had seen King in New York there. So King in New York came out in 57, as we know, but it didn't get to other places until much later. So India in 1961. This one, I believe, it's called a collaboration between Peter Orlovsky and Allen Ginsberg, but I really believe that it was written by Ginsberg. And the reason for that is that I went through Orlovsky's archive very carefully. There was nothing in there about it, but everything was in Ginsberg's archive. So that's certainly not definitive, but it helps. I'm only going to read a part of it to you. It's kind of a parody letter, so I checked with the Chaplin family. They never received it, so... Dear friend Charles, love letter for you. We are one happy poet and one unhappy poet in India, which makes two poets. We would like to come visit you when we get through India to tickle your feet. Furthermore, King in New York is great picture. I figure it will take about 10 years before it looks funny in perspective. It's about right. Every few years we dream in our sleep we meet you. Do you realize how many times we have seen your pictures in Newark and cried in the dark at the Roses? Do you realize how many summers in Coney Island we sat in open-air theater and watched you disguised as a lampshade in scratchy down chairs eternity? You made even our dead mothers laugh. So remember, everything is all right. We await your next move, and the world still depends on your next move. You should make a great picture with the atom bomb. Here comes the correlation now with Agee's play about the Little Tramp of the New World. Synops, a grubby old janitor with white hair who can't get the air raid drill instructions right and goes about his own lost business in the basement in the midst of the great international air raid emergencies, sirens, Kremlin riots, flying rockets, radios, screaming, destruction of the earth. He comes out the next day. He crawls out of the pile of human Empire State Building bodies, and the rest of the picture, a whole hour, the janitor on the screen alone, making believe he is being sociable with nobody there, having a beer at the bar with invisible boys, reading last year's newspapers, and ending looking blankly into the camera with the eternal aged Chaplin face looking blankly, raptly into the eyes of the god of solitude. This is your final fitting statement, Sir Chaplin. You will save the world if you make it, but your final look must be so beautiful that it doesn't matter if the world is saved or not. Love and Flowers, Peter Orlovsky and Allen Ginsberg. So like James Agee's unfinished film script, Ginsberg and Orlovsky seem to have picked up on the logic of the little tramp being the New World representative of humanity after atomic bomb annihilation. I think that's rather extraordinary that it came up in different places. They imagine him as humanity's hope for tomorrow. But Allen Ginsberg himself had a much closer sort of a, that doesn't seem to be the right one. Okay, hold on a second here. I got him out of order. Allen Ginsberg himself seems to have had more than a passing interest in Chaplin, and that's because his mother was also institutionalized when he was a young man. He went through some of the same things as well, and I want to talk about a couple of poems that I found in the archives. One of them is in the archives only, actually, and one of them is not published as a poem, but it's included in his Indian journals, which came out a couple of times. The first is called H star, Y star, M star, N star, T star, O star, U star, S star. And I think that can be either translated as hymn to us or hymn to US. I'm not sure which. So this is only in a notebook entry in the archives. He starts out by saying, he, O mother American democracy, who in the cremation ground of nations with disheveled hair and Chaplin pants beaten bathless except in the sweat of intensity, intensely mediates inside himself on thee and makes public his secret offerings to thee in poetry, music, or electrical engineering. He alone may know thy cosmic bed. So this poem, which could be interpreted, as I said, to mean hymn to us or hymn to US, brings Ginsberg back to his political poetry. This is May 4th, 1961. And so the anarchist of the poem, naturally, has Little Tramp characteristics, which is interesting. And then, I think I've got this right now, in his Indian journals, he composes a long poem to Chaplin. It's too bad it didn't make it into any of the poetry books, really. Because it's longer than any of Ferlinghetti's, and it's totally about Chaplin himself. It was written on March 24th, 1964, and I'm going to read a part of the poem that is not in the published versions, and then we'll go on to the published part. So it starts out as a dream in his journals, and it says simply in the written journals, Kalipada Guha Roy, banded Easter eggs. Don't punch hole open until you get all holes simultaneous, and the product oozes out in order. Next paragraph, boy conman slob, tall climbing up on the hummock, the field where sadhus sold wares in grass, and the glass bowls of cotton that look like sadhus, white mustaches, beards, and head hair. So those are just kind of, journal ramblings. And then he starts talking about Chaplin all of a sudden. He says, unless and until Chaplin is back, I resign. Should they ask him back, where could he come? The newspapers would scream attack again. Poor once-child Charlie with his white hair, roaming alone in Hollywood's crummy streets. Norma Talmadge dead, all his old enemies dead. Hearst's wrinkles turned to dust, and Luella and Hetty, senile card players in Texacan swimming pools. I just love the way he puts words together. It's so lyrical. Underwater trading ghosted autobiographies. Nothing but thin film of acrid smog level. of the roofs, cars swifting by and bus snorts, and strangers on the pave in checked suits selling the universe insurance. Even if he walked mustached and baggy-pantsed, nobody'd notice. Nobody'd give him a dime, and the police wouldn't agree. Hollywood is changed and dry, and Chaplin's old wet nose smells Switzerland at the end of the colossal sweet dream all alone. The big city's vanished, and radar makes the traffic lights blink green and red. All the old directors' houses with tennis trees and swimming pools, lines with butlers and mahogany huge rooms sit in space, dusty, and poor Charlot, with $1 million in his baggy trouser cuffs, wanders aimlessly down Vine looking for his ancient studio roofs, and his dead Jewish cameraman Stravinsky sits around retired smoking cigars by his grandchild's girlish coffin, and the world is finished with me. 1920s America vanished into crackly rolls of celluloid, the big green, huge-wheeled car with neat black canvas roof. Even Buster Keaton got rheumatism and couldn't fall off ladders into the grave without staying there forever anymore. Beatniks and electronic workers collect paychecks in Straub's drugstore, and what plump-breasted little girl wants to sleep with a part in the pics because the television hustlers and sharkskin hips with unwrinkled laps full of zippers are too flip to fuck for romantic fun in front of the Late Late Show. Charlie by Charlie, lonely at last, and realized even his mustached genius, film forgotten, and the Depression talkies buzzing and zapping in flashes of blue light under the pavement's radiators. So you can see this is really an elegy for old Hollywood, this particular poem. That's starting out with poor once-child Charlie with his white hair. I love that image. So we can think of Charlie, who would have been 74 years old at the time, and then he would have returned in Ginsberg's idea to Hollywood 10 years after he had left. And what he finds there is degradation, decay, and inauthenticity. Norma Talmadge and William Randolph Hearst have died and turned to dust. Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper, Hollywood gossip columnists, are working on their ghosted autobiographies. What an idea. Even Buster Keaton, can't stay on the ladder anymore. And then we have Chaplin, himself a bit of a contradiction, for dusty and poor Charlot with $1 million in his baggy trouser cuffs can no longer be a beat icon, it seems. And in fact, this particular poem is the last time Ginsberg ever uses Chaplin in anything, and he had, up until this point, used him over and over. I'm just giving you a sample here. And with this particular poem, it's like, okay, this is it. I'm done. And he never mentions the name again, which I think is pretty interesting. Now I'm going to go back here because I've got Kaufman's slide in the wrong place. And I wanted to show you Bob Kaufman because you don't normally get to see him. He's kind of one of the beats that is less known about, but really, really important to the movement. So the next thing that he did was called The Enormous Gas Bill at the Dwarf Factory. And it was included in a book called The Golden Sardine. And this is the one that uses the Carol Chessman case. And so I wanted to show you some pictures of Bob Kaufman sitting with everybody. And you can see that Ferlinghetti looks old then. He's now 98. But he looked old in the 70s. All right, here we are with the Chessman case. This is one of Bob Kaufman's, cause célèbre as usual. And this particular person was convicted of 17 counts of burglary, kidnapping, and rape in 1948. And a lot of stars came to his case, or tried to help out and try to get his conviction stayed because they were using an old law that had to do with the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, if you remember that said that if someone was carried 20 feet or 22 feet from one place to another, that was considered kidnapping. So they felt that many of the 17 counts that he was convicted of were, something that should not be. So even Eleanor Roosevelt got in on this and was speaking for him. Billy Graham, there's another odd one. And so Bob Kaufman joined in on them. Still, he went to the gas chamber on May 2nd, 1960. But specifically in this parody film strip, Kaufman uses linguistic play on the name Carol Chessman. Kind of figure out it's kind of sounds like Charlie Chaplin a little bit. So to sort of elaborate the injustice he saw in the case. So as scholar Maria Damon points out, Kaufman manipulates Carroll Chessman's name to place him in a heroic pantheon that includes Carroll Melville, Carl Darrow, F. Scott Chessman, and Charlie Chaplin. And so that's how he particularly uses it in this particular fake play. Chessman becomes mythified through the fragmentation and dispersal of his name. And as in any instance of wrongful death at the hands of the powerful, the analogy to Christ's crucifixion offers itself, crossing over from the dominant culture to serve as a charged subtext. Okay. Ferlinghetti's renewed, now here we're going to get some of these archival documents, and I don't think these have been seen before. Ferlinghetti's renewed interest in Chaplin in the 70s seems to coincide with his re-release of films, perhaps in the mid-1960s. I know in 1965 he released in one particular theater in New York City. So his 1969 poem, In a Time of Revolution, for instance, is included in this collection, Open Eye, Open Heart, from 1973, in which he again equates the poet with Chaplin, but only as a sort of afterthought. So in the 70s, Chaplin is in the news, perhaps. He's coming back to the States in 72, so Ferlinghetti is kind of a little bit beyond the Chaplin character in his work, but he keeps remembering and plugging him in kind of late in the process. So someone like me who studies the writing process, it's really interesting to see. So in an experience inspired by an interaction at the Feed Bag on Geary Street in San Francisco on December 16th, 1969, with three, quote, beautiful people, 2 men and a woman, Ferlinghetti considers in the lines of the poem his chances with the beautiful female stranger. He expresses his insecurity in approaching her, writing, "She was a beautiful creature, and I felt like Charlie Chaplin eating his shoe when her eyes slid over me." In the first handwritten draft of the poem, written on December 17th, the quoted lines are added to the page in handwriting half the size of the rest, signaling for me later insertion. Perhaps while writing about his own particular lunch, fish looking not quite unfrozen and quite plastic, Ferlinghetti remembers the scene in Chaplin's The Gold Rush in which the little tramp and his companion, Big Jim McKay, are forced to cook and eat Charlie's boot for their evening meal. The line suggests not only this image of an unpalatable, hard to consume meal, but also links the poet's condition with the little tramp's embarrassed and unconfident condition at the moment, as well as the concept of starvation in general. For Ferlinghetti, a sort of sexual starvation and a classic link between food and the sexual act. The poet's lack of confidence is then quickly contrasted with his growing confidence in his important to socio-political commentary, when he inserts that in a time of revolution, for instance, as consummate rebel, his position would have been different, important, powerful, much as beauty made the three strangers at the moment, and his conquest of the female would have been unflinching and successful. Little Tramp figure captures both of these manifestations of Ferlinghetti's poet especially well, because he is at once introverted and unconfident, and also a rebel against authority. Much more important poem is this one from 1976, which was the American Bicentennial, for those of you that don't know that. And it's called The Director of Alienation. And this is, on the left there is the broadside, which was illustrated by Ferlinghetti himself. Ferlinghetti is also an artist. And it's sort of a rant against American consumerism and waste back in the 1970s. And we can see that this particular illustration, first of all, kind of looks like might be influenced by Chaplin a little bit, but it's really a self-portrait of Ferlinghetti. So he's become this sort of beat man of the crowd himself. So another thing about the poem that I'm going to read part of is that it was influenced by the department store scene in modern times. And you can see that immediately. This is just a portion, so it's much, much longer. Looking in the mirrors at Macy's and thinking it's a subterranean plot to make me feel like Chaplin snuck in with his bent shoes and beat bowler, looking for a fair-haired angel. Who's this bum crept in off the streets, blinking in the neon, an anarchist among the floor walkers, a strike breaker even. Right past the pickets and the picket line, is the people yet? I think I'll hook a new derby with my cane and put a sign on it reading, Director of Alienation, or The Real Revolution. So it's Mr. Alienation, is it? Like he don't like nobody? So like Bob Kaufman's Chaplin, Ferlinghetti's in this poem is also a criminal of the state of sorts. And he says, I might get caught fingering the lingerie, feeling up the mannequins, house sticks after me. He is outside the law and as such both an observer and harsh critic of American culture. The poem says, what's this rack of civilization I've fallen into? This must be the end of something, the last days of somebody's empire. And in April 1976, nobody's ever seen this photo but you all. It's not in the book. Ferlinghetti appeared as the character at an event at the Little Fox Theater in San Francisco to benefit Bob Kaufman's literary magazine called Beatitude. So he wore this derby hat with a sign attached identifying him as the director of Alienation. And then he read the poem to the crowd outside, both inside and outside. So his biographer, Neely Cherkovsky, reported, with the sympathetic alliance Ferlinghetti always felt with ordinary people, with those not as privileged, or which both the Chaplin Derby and the poem are representative, he repeated the performance outside for free to the delight of the 100 or so who could not get in. So that's an awesome picture, I think. And then, of course, Adieu a Charlot's Second Populist Manifesto. I have some great drafts to show you here. You can see there's a lot of work done on this particular poem. It was supposedly an homage to Chaplin that was started before his death. However, Ferlinghetti actually began the poem in 1975 in Tepoztlan, Mexico. And like other Chaplin poems, the tramp character doesn't come into the poem until the final lines and final drafts. In fact, the tribute to Chaplin, one that ends up part of the title of the poem, Adieu a Charlot, was not completed until 1978. Partially, of course, because Chaplin didn't die till Christmas Day, 1977. Perhaps his death gave the poem a better structural center than it had before because it was left fallow for 3 years. But Ferlinghetti did pick it up in late 77 before Chaplin died and started working on it. He has a draft, I don't think this is the one, but one of the drafts I saw was dated December 29th, 1977, and the Chaplin figure had not appeared in it yet. But then it appears in the January 8th, 1978 draft in its first incarnations. So through additions, deletions, and a large black marker sketch of the head of Chaplin's tramp. Now we can argue about it. I think it might look like Chaplin. It might look like Ferlinghetti again. So I'm not sure about that. But that's on the last draft of the poem. So let me read a little bit of it here. Let's see, what time is it? All right, I'm going to skip the first draft part. All right. Okay. All right. So this is the first draft of it, which then changes when it becomes published a little bit. First, he says, Franco is dead, but so is Picasso. Chaplin is dead, but we wear his bowler, having outlived all our myths but his. The myth of the pure subjective inside each of us, the little man inside the big man trying to break out. The big woman inside the little man in each of us, standing on street corners, waiting with Charlot or beside a country road with blind Pazzo. In the great American night that closes down surely and fiercely on every street corner, we see them, hidden inside their tight, clean clothes. Their hats are not derbies, but they have no canes. But we know them. We have always waited with them. They turn and hitch their pants and tip their hats and walk away from us down the long road. That's the first and only time you'll hear that particular draft. And then with this draft, he's working hard to implement the Little Tramp's persona's physical characteristics into the poem while still remaining on task, while still projecting his ideas about poetry and the poet in the manifesto tradition. So actually, Ferlinghetti wrote 3 manifestos. This is the second. The third is going to come a little bit later. Again, it seems to be important for Ferlinghetti to link the Chaplin persona with the figure of the poet, the collective subjective, or by extrapolation himself. So now I'm going to read that last part in the final draft, or the way it was published. And you can see that it's changed a little bit for the better, believe me. So he says, Chaplin is dead, but I'd wear his bowler, having outlived all our myths but his, the myth of the pure subjective, the collective subjective, the little man in each of us. Waiting with Charlot or Pazzo, on every corner I see them, hidden inside their tight, clean clothes. Their hats are not derbies, they have no canes. But we know them, we have always waited with them. They turn and hitch their pants and walk away from us down the darkening road in the great American night. Much improved. So in these final lines, Ferlinghetti's narrative seems to believe in at least the myth of the pure subjective, the collective subjective, that was key to the Little Tramp's connection to his previous audiences. Ferlinghetti's understanding of the subjective, can't say that word, that force was that force opposed to the mechanistic institutional power of the modern state. So his second manifesto worked double duty as an homage to Chaplin on his death. So also, as this shows you, he put Chaplin's final moments from The Tramp in 1915 on the cover of the City Lights Journal that year that came out in December. And also he had a store window built in design for an homage to Chaplin at the same time. And that was taken. There's a photo somewhere by Ira Nowinski about that. Biographer and critic Michael McClure argues that Ferlinghetti's The Rebels, included in All the Unseen Boundaries in 1984, marked the end of the poet's identification with the Chaplin persona. Ferlinghetti himself, however, suggests otherwise. So in a KQED broadcast, that's a radio broadcast, October 16th, 1990, that's a good 6 years after McClure's argument, he states, with the state encroaching more and more worldwide on the freedom of the individual, the position of the poet as bearer of Eros, and as such an anarchist against the state, by definition, is the little man in each of us, the subjective in each of us, which is so graphically illustrated by Chaplin and his little man character. It's as if the state and modern civilization in general were out to destroy the subjective in each of us. So here again, we see these touchstone words for Ferlinghetti: poet as bearer of Eros, anarchist, little man, enemy of the state. So 3 years later, in an interview conducted by Danny O'Brien in Louisville, Kentucky, Ferlinghetti reiterates and reemphasizes those words. Why is the Charlie Chaplin image of the little man with the bowler and the cane still so potent, he says? Because he represents the free individual. He represents the subjective in everyone. He represents Eros, the love-seeking, life-seeking, pleasure-seeking, free speech-seeking spirit that is constantly under attack by the state, capital S and small s. The definition of the poet or the artist is free subjective being, free creative spirit. By definition, it just has to be an enemy of the state. So Chaplin, poet, anarchist, Eros, by this point in Ferlinghetti's thinking about these terms, becomes synonymous more than a complex internecine system of metaphors, forever linked in his mind as a constellation of words that finally get at the idea of the poet. All terms are now linked to in his conception of the free subjective being. So the last Ferlinghetti book that I'm going to talk about is this one, which he made in 1995. So he's now, quite old. This is also in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's called In Search of Eros. No surprise there. And it's really a kind of a homage to Ferlinghetti himself. It is a compilation of his some interviews and some artistic works. And so the cover is by Ferlinghetti, and those of you that know Chaplin at all realize that he's copied Chaplin's own little cartoon of himself. You may have seen that before someplace. That's Ferlinghetti's interpretation of that. That's on the cover. And then inside is this drawing, the only drawing of Chaplin that's actually labeled to be Chaplin that I've found that's Ferlinghetti's. And I want to end with this particular item that I found. So the University of North Dakota has this renowned writers' conference, which was developed by English professor John R. Whopper Little, and it featured in its 5th year an event called City Lights in North Dakota. That was on March 18th to 22nd, 1974. And for me, this stands alone as an indicator of the sort of place that Chaplin's Little Tramp has in beat art, pretty much, because you can see the poster features a very familiar Chaplin image on it. And also, the next slide is a picture of all the beat artists who were there. So we have Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, Gregory Corso, Kenneth Rexroth, Gary Snyder, still alive, Kate McDonough, Miriam Patchen, and the bookstore manager Shig Morrell and Michael McClure, with the event touted as the first time this group had appeared on stage together in 20 years. And you can see on one side, and I can't point to it, over there, Chaplin's head in a long sort of a film strip thing on the side of the wall. So a full 20 years after the founding of the City Lights Bookshop, it's clear that Chaplin's persona had retained its status as an icon of Beat Generation artistry and politics as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Do you want questions?
Yeah, that's fine, if somebody has any.
Thank you so much. This is really, really, really interesting. There's time for a few questions, in fact, if any of you would like to venture.
Frank?
What do you think was the most interesting discovery that you found when you got into this particular line of research?
Boy, it was all interesting to me, really. I think one of the things I was most surprised about was, and I shouldn't have been surprised about it, was that Chaplin was also often inserted in late drafts of things. And so that really kind of suggested to me that he wasn't like foremost in their minds, but sort of an afterthought at some points, you know. And maybe he was simply plugged in for sort of, name dropping kind of a thing. I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about that. But I thought it was interesting that he appeared in late drafts in many of these works. So.
I was actually stunned on how all this material was uncovered before you started digging, really. It was almost a shock, because it's very extremely relevant.
Yeah.
Especially because exactly around that time, the late 40s, in fact, what we knew really, basically until this research, is the opposite of a reevaluation. Mm-hmm. Knowing only the point of view of what was happening on a larger mass perception of Charlie and his films and the boycott and everything. So this was really a great discovery. And so and also, to be honest, there's not a lot in the Chaplin archive, so the letters that weren't sent and everything. So, and I think I asked you this already, but for me, even though the differences are so many, but I do see a parallel in a very different way of what happened with the avant-garde movement in Europe in the 1920s, in the sense of, and that was so earlier on, so this idea of the tramp embodying freedom and anarchy and had been established through, 3 periods of short comedy. So we're already talking about dozens of films, but not as well established by the end of the 40s. And I know it's related to a completely different aesthetic framework, but it does resonate to me as how this counterculture movements, with all due respective differences, embraced almost immediately and saw almost immediately in this figure such a strong counterculture force and voice. Mm-hmm. So
I haven't talked to you since I finished the book, but I did want to mention that Ferlinghetti has a PhD from the Sorbonne in Paris, and he was actually studying those people that you were just talking about from the 1920s. So he might be the link. I don't know. So he was definitely influenced by them, the modernists. So.
Anyway, no more questions, I believe. Thank you very. Oh yes, we have another question over there.
I wanted to ask, we saw how these writers talk about Chaplin, but what was their access to films, actually? I mean, did they see them a lot of times? They saw them once and then talked about them. Maybe there were screenings. They tried to make them see also to people. I don't know. How was the film thing managed?
Actually, in the book, I have a whole chapter on the way in which those films were encountered. Many of them were, I can't think of it now, revival houses. So they were being shown, some of them, not the feature films so much, but as I said, I believe the Chaplin family released for one time in 1965, I believe, a whole set of features in one particular theater in New York. And so they were seen there. I think some of them were actually being remembered from, like, Ferlinghetti, his childhood or something. I'm not sure he would have been in New York to see that one particular showing of films. But they were seeing them once and then remembering what they had seen as children. So in the parody letter that I just talked about, with Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky, they talk about seeing the mutuals in there when they were children. So when you see things as a child, that's where I get my inspiration for all of this, was from my childhood. So I'm assuming that the poets did as well, you know.
And by then the mutual has been in public domain.
Mutuals
forever,
are in public domain, and the keystones and the SNAs, yeah.
So also seen in not exactly how Chaplin had intended, but seen, I believe, in many different, even associational circles. They could be screened anywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
In your home,
in your home, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.